Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I got a really good guest today. We're going to talk about the economic fallout of the virus, of the reaction that the government's had to it. It's not going to be very partisan, and I think we're going to try our best not to cast a lot of our judgments on it, but kind of just get to the facts of what's going on with the economics of it. So I'm really happy to introduce my guest today, and his name's Monir Mamoun, and he's an entrepreneur and has a master's degree from Yale University, and really is interested in economics both as a hobby and something that he's looked at very carefully. So thank you so much for being here, Monir. We're really excited to have someone who can explain some of these difficult things to us.
My pleasure, Rob. It's an honor to be here today.
All right. I'll just say to the chat real quick, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. We can try to get to them. And let us know if there's any audio problems or anything. It looks like it'll be good on my end, though. So one of the things that I wanted to get started off, there's so much going on here. I sent you kind of a list of things that we might possibly talk about. So I thought that the very first question we should kind of talk about is, can you just give us a brief overview of what's at stake when we're talking about these huge numbers, like potentially a third of adults that are of the employable age being unemployed now, and the GDP contracting by possibly as much as a third and spending trillions of dollars? What's kind of the overview of what's at stake here with that?
Well, I guess you could say the two big things at stake are the human impact first and foremost, because that's what the economy is, really the economic actions and coordinations of people. There's also the human cost of this disease and the impact of it and psychological burden that's putting on all of us. The other impact that stems from that is the economic impact and what it means for the dollars and cents flowing around that together, bound up in the financial system, the credit system, allow us to interoperate with each other in the economy.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things is, I understand it's a very difficult thing. There's no right answer to when you're trading off safety and trying to keep safe from the virus versus trading off rights or trading off economic impact that could come from it. But I think that we would both agree that there are economic questions that it's not flippant to be concerned about a massive economic decline or anything like that. I think that our leaders have to find a middle ground, wouldn't you say, to how to stave off this virus while at the same time trying to limit the impact of the economic impact that will result.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, at the end of the day, politics and rights, these are matters of power. And when people are disenfranchised from the economy, and if there's a big crisis, a recession, depression, it really has, it's inherently a political situation because people get cut off from their normal ways of expressing themselves and being able to participate with others. It affects a lot of things, how people relate, not just with each other, with their day-to-day finances, but how they relate with the government as well. So it's all kind of tied up, and that is it's very serious from that respect.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. So with that in mind, one of the first things I wanted to talk about was, I don't know if you have the exact number of what the deficit is now. I think it's over 20 trillion. What does it mean when the deficit gets that high? What does that look like to a normal average person when that deficit gets higher and higher?
So what we call the deficit, that's the amount of money that is the kind of imbalance between the shortfall between income and expenditure on a year-to-year basis. And every year that deficit gets added up into this big pile called the debt, the national debt. So the national debt right now stands at something like, I think about something like $24 trillion. We're looking at about, just from the couple of programs, the immediate coronavirus relief for unemployment and for loans. And then a couple of days ago, there was a $2 trillion longer-term infrastructure initiative announced. $4 trillion is pretty big. I mean, that's about a sixth of what we have right now. And you can anticipate that'll probably grow with time as the scope of the recovery operation becomes more apparent.
Yeah, and it's I think that what we lose sight of with the average American is these numbers are so massive that it seems almost imaginary. Like, oh, the Fed could just print more money, or we could put more tallies on a balance sheet and it'll work out. At the end of the day, these people take it. But there is a point in time where once that debt gets to a certain point, that it will have significant repercussions even on the average American. Do you have a number in your mind that once we start to get to a level of so much, or maybe not a number, but just a situation where we could start to see significant impacts on the American family?
I don't think we're necessarily at the point of immediate crisis, but certainly if the debt keeps growing, the debt has to get paid back in some way. Even if you consider it an accounting entry, it shifts money around from one place to another. And once debt gets too big, because the debt is financed, we have to pay that debt collectively as a country. It's coming from taxes for the most part, or keep the interest payments going on the debt. And when taxes aren't enough, the debt just grows faster. It becomes a compound interest that keeps it growing. And once you get to a few, for the United States, country the size of the United States, with the productive power of the United States, I think if we had a couple of tens of trillions more, we'd start to see some really, really serious effects. We're already starting to see some effects. You have student loan issues and other healthcare funding issues that people are wondering, how can we achieve these things or take care of these things? So it becomes a progressively bigger drag with time. Countries that have historically lost control of their debt go into hyperinflation. It's happened a few times in history, and that usually leads to a collapse of the government, and then sometimes worse. So it's a big deal, and we do have to keep an eye on it.
Yeah. So one of the things when I talked to you previously that I was interested in, that you were talking about, that I didn't have a great understanding of, was exactly how the actions that we're seeing being taken now are trying to buttress the stock market against the sort of collapse we saw in 2008. And you talked about the idea of margin calls once the stock market starts free falling so much. Could you explain a little of what the government's trying to do to prevent that, and what happens when these margin calls are called in and how that affects us?
I'm not sure the government is directly going to be affecting doing something about margin calls per se. What a margin call is a very, very large portion of today's stock market is actually supported by borrowed money. Something like about a quarter to a third of the entire value of the stock market as invested in the S&P 500, which itself represents about 80% of the country's stock market value. Something like a quarter of that comes from borrowed money. So people or institutions borrowing to leverage the amount of stock they can buy. The existing stock they own is considered the collateral, and then they borrow money on top of that. The problem is when you have sharp, broad market declines, what happens is like most loans, margins can be called in, meaning that the debtor has to immediately come up with the money. In normal times, usually you get about 3 days to make a margin call. If the stock goes back up, you're fine. You don't have to pay the money back. But if you have a large drop, a broad market drop at once, the margin calls, and brokers can call them in faster than 3 days if they wish. Those margin calls result in forced liquidation of stock and potentially bond assets in order for people to get back into their allowable margin requirements, which is at most leverage about 50%. The average leverage is more like about a quarter, but if you lose a third of your stock market value, you're still going to have to make the margin call. And that's what we saw a couple of weeks ago. Really interesting phenomenon. Usually short term, when the stock market goes up, people are investing in stock, they're selling bonds. And when people sell bonds and depress the prices, the interest rate goes up with bonds. We saw that relationship break a couple of weeks ago. People were selling off everything at the same time, stocks and bonds. So at the same time that the market was going down, interest rates were also going up, which is kind of the opposite of the usual mechanism we see. So that indicates that there was a lot of margin activity, and that indicates that money has actually gotten vaporized from the market. Like nominal dollars have gotten erased. When you see a lot of dollars get erased from the market at once, it creates a long-term impact. People are unable to spend like they thought they would, unable to recover their money, and it creates a contractionary effect. So that's a big deal because when that happens, the impact lasts for a long time and depressing economic activity in general.
Yeah, and I think that there's this. We'll talk about more other effects on the economy that we could see with what's going on. But with the stock market in general, I think that there's this idea from a lot of people in my area of the world, like rural Pennsylvania, that maybe don't necessarily have big investments in the market. Oh, who cares about the market? It doesn't affect me. But that's not the case, as you're saying, because when we see those sorts of declines there, that ends up leading to contraction in the economy as a whole. And can you explain just real quickly how that might mean the average person who works at, a factory in a small town, how that could affect them?
Yeah, I mean, the economy is really kind of a set of very carefully coordinated spinning plates is the best way to describe it. When some people start spinning plates, and people who own a lot of stock, those are wealthy people or big institutions or big funds, represents not only large investors but pension funds and other people start losing that, and they see that it depresses economic demand whenever it happens. And you'll inevitably see the ripple impact spread everywhere. If people are driving less or consuming less or buying less, because we're all connected with each other in this economic web, it does impact all of us, and the impact hits sooner rather than later for most people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I thought one of the ways to go through this would be to kind of break it into the different emergency spending bills that we have. So the first bill that I wanted to talk about was the $2 trillion bill that has already passed. That included like the idea of sending the $1,200 check to individuals, giving money to the airlines, to other corporations. So the first question I had about this is a lot of people are focusing on how much of this money is going to billion-dollar corporations. How long will it take for money that goes to those corporations to see an impact on normal Americans? In other words, I believe the argument is, well, we have to bail out these businesses because they employ people. So how long until we see that affect people that are in a pinch right now, regular Americans?
Well, that's a really good question, Rob. It's hard to say exactly for a couple of reasons. Number one, what are businesses using that money for? Is a question. I'll give you an example from the airline industry. That's one of the industries that's been mentioned recently. The airline industry has had earmarked for it something on the range of about $50 billion in relief. And where does that go? About half of that is earmarked for keeping wages going of actual airline employees. So that'll get to people, we could say, reasonably quickly. I don't know if it'll be weeks, but maybe in the next few months. People will get paid, and they'll get paid for a while in varying amounts. So that'll get to people pretty quickly. The other half of that goes into debt service, because airlines are extremely highly leveraged businesses. For the most part, they don't really own their planes. They operate their planes, but really owe a tremendous amount of money to them for them. For example, American Airlines owes something north of $20 trillion at last count. They swing up and down, but somewhere between 25 to $35 trillion, billion dollars is just American Airlines. That's how much debt they have on the balance sheet. So you can see $25 billion right there is not a lot for for the entire industry when they're unable to pay for those assets. So they need that money just to pay their bills, so they don't go broke and have to declare bankruptcy. So that money will not immediately go to your average Joe. It's going to take a while for that to filter around that, so part of that money keeps people paid, and part of the money just keeps the supply chain and large industries from collapsing, especially the heavily leveraged ones that have a lot of debt.
Yeah, and that makes, and I can understand the argument, even though it does seem problematic, and if we got into exactly how it was divvied out and things like that, there could be problems with it. But I do think that if you would see something like the airlines collapse, certainly it would take a long time to fill that gap for another company could come in and fill that. And I think surely the airlines collapsing would lead to economic impacts that are also not foreseeable if we would just let them collapse. So I guess that's the idea, right? We can't leave these crucial industries collapse, or it'll have an even ripple effect further out through the economy.
It'll tend to do that, yeah, because what happens is shareholders get wiped out first, and then people who hold debt get wiped out next. That's the order, of who's prioritized. So debt holders to those companies are due first to get paid, and then common stockholders will get paid. That means the companies go bankrupt, and then it wouldn't necessarily stop operation. Companies can keep operating even when they go bankrupt. But in a reorganization, a bankruptcy reorganization, generally ownership shifts, and that can prove disruptive too. Just the uncertainty there. So in the meantime, usually operations are somewhat curtailed until the economic situation gets sorted out, and it could take courts months at the fastest to work out really complex situations like that.
Yeah.
Typically years. So yeah.
Wow. Okay, so the next question I had about this bill is, how long will the $1,200 a person that's in the bill be able to hold people over on average? In other words, if the government let's assume that the lockdown's going to continue for 2-3 more months. Is there a point in your estimation where this 1,200 just won't be enough for the average American to continue to, pay their bills and have their homes and livelihoods the way that it's been?
I can tell you the average American makes about 45 to 50,000 a year. So you're really talking about a little bit more than a week's pay for most people. Families will get a little bit more if they have two people on their tax return, and families with children get another $500 per child. You could say it's going to at best be 3 weeks. How long would $2,500 or $3,000 last most families? Right. So it's going to be a Band-Aid, really. We're going to need more than that to get us through this cycle, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things this was just kind of news here in the past day that I've been thinking about. So we didn't talk about this previously, but I'm seeing now problems with the massive amounts of people that are filing for unemployment. How long is there enough money to last to be able to support possibly a third of the country being on unemployment? I mean, I'm reading that right now they're worried that they could be hitting the limits of that sooner than they thought, of how much money's in that pool for unemployment.
Yeah, and those things kind of vary by state also. Some states are a little bit better funded than others because they collect more aggressively. I know Florida, for example, they have a very thin, a relatively small pile of money. I've heard it's, I don't know, something like less than $100 million potentially. So that doesn't go very far. The fact is that this is where states are going to have to borrow, and I think that to keep those systems solvent for very long, they're not. Those systems are designed to handle 2, 3, 4% unemployment.
Right.
30% is going to definitely have an impact, and they're not going to be replenished as quickly either. So. I think you're going to see people's priorities shift. Their political priorities are going to shift a little bit in response to the urgent crisis, or at least they'll put the typical ideologies will take a little bit less prominence as people realize, hey, we just have a practical problem to solve right now.
Yeah, agreed. How do you think they decided how to divvy up money based on sending it to the big corporations versus the small businesses? I'm reading articles today that say that there are thousands of small businesses that were shocked to see that they don't qualify for this. Do you think that more money should have been sent to small businesses, or do you think that kind of the balance that they brought was all right?
The balance is pretty close. I think businesses may be shocked or maybe difficult to apply. I'm not sure, but from what I last saw, so I'll give you an approximate breakdown. Small businesses, they are actually the vast majority of businesses. Something like 99.7% of businesses are small businesses. Large businesses employ more people. On average, as a portion of the economy, it's about 50-50. So the amount of money that is going to large corporations so far earmarked is about $500 billion, and small businesses about almost $400 billion. So it's not that far off. And I think the issue with smaller companies is that they're just not used to going to the government like large companies are. Large companies have a lot of resources. They have people, dedicated teams, dedicated to getting money, borrowing money, and dealing with those situations. Small businesses, what are they going to do? They're going to go to their bank for the distribution. The bank's going to work with the government. A lot of small business owners just they've heard of the Small Business Administration, but they don't really work with it. So I think that's going to be the toughest thing. Getting the money to the small businesses out there is going to be challenging. And being able to vet them and figure out what they need and how they're affected by the coronavirus is going to be challenging. So I think that's going to be the toughest part to really administer.
Yeah, and I agree with you. So my wife works in a bank, and their bank's going to be one of the banks that's giving out proportioning part of these loans, working with the government to small businesses, and she's getting a lot of talk from just local small businesses in my area. They just don't know how to go about applying. They don't know the ins and outs. Like, for example, and maybe you can speak to this. There's interest rates, but you don't have to pay those interest rates back if you use the money for certain things, such as if such a percentage of the money you borrow goes to payroll, I believe, something like 80%, then you don't have to pay the interest back. So it seems to me that it's not just a matter of giving the money out. And I think this is a theme we'll see throughout all of these. It's how they explain to people how that money's going out and who's overseeing the process.
And one of the toughest things I think is going to be actually with small businesses is figuring out how much of that money is actually going to be loans and how much is going to be grants and how much of it is going to be loans that are forgiven and turn into grants. Because right now there's a gap in demand, and small businesses have their bills they have to keep paying just like the bigger companies. But in a lot of cases, they're not used to dealing with a lot of debt. And for a lot of small business owners, debt goes on credit cards. And so the fact that they're going to be having to deal with these financial tools that they're not that familiar with, or it's probably going to be what really trips up a lot of companies. So I think that's going to be a part of the economy where we're going to have to sort that out. We're going to have to really have some smart government programs that are dealing with that, which I'm not super convinced right now that there's a plan yet, but hopefully that's on the way.
Now, looking at this bill, just this one particularly that we're talking about, the one that already passed, I've looked through it myself. It's so massive, it's hard to get a total handle on it. But how much would you estimate, in your opinion, would be things that you would consider not an emergency response? So we've all heard money that went to the Kennedy Center or money that was earmarked for this or that, the normal porks things that we normally hear. Do you think that it's that they did a pretty good job, that it's only a small portion that maybe would be for frivolous things? Or do you think it's enough to warrant concern?
I don't know. Look, I think that one is a really tough one to see. That we're going to see how that plays out. You could say Kennedy Center might be non-emergency, but it's people's jobs.
Right.
So it's hard to say. That part there, I think it's really going to boil down to, can we develop, cost benefit guidelines that figure out, how much are organizations going to get, businesses or non-business type organizations? How much are they going to get to keep people employed and keep them active and maintain demand in the economy? Keep people afloat until the economy starts to recover. I think that's where we're going to start to see, that's where we're going to start to see the toughest questions that come out of this process.
Is there, like, just the final point in this, was there something that you would have liked to have seen added that you think could have had more of an immediate impact on people, or an emergency gap that needs filled that you didn't see kind of addressed by this bill?
So, so there is something that most people don't realize, is that we actually have a socialized medical system and have had one for decades. And the socialized medical system we have is that if you don't have money, but you show up at the hospital and you need to get served, you're going to get served. It is a legal obligation of a hospital to stabilize you, whether or not you can pay or have insurance, and that gets sorted out later. So that's why a lot of people who have, show up with a flu to the emergency room and now are showing up with COVID, because that's the unacknowledged, in a way, kind of socialist, medicine system that we have. And that cost is passed on to hospitals. It's passed on eventually to consumers who have private insurance. There's a little bit of reimbursement from Medicaid, but Medicaid payments are actually not enough to pay expenses. They're actually money for hospitals and doctors. The great crisis that we're seeing now that hasn't been talked about much, that we're going to see more and more, that is already happening in droves. We're seeing many hospital employees are actually getting laid off in the midst of this crisis. So it's a huge gap. It works dysfunctionally and somewhat during normal times, and during this crisis, that's when you see the whole system is falling apart. And you're seeing, like, I think Kaiser announced there were, one hospital says in Boston Medical, they're laying off a couple thousand people or something like that. That's happening all across the country. How do you keep hospitals going when so much of the administrative staff now can't come to work because the hospitals are losing $5 or $10 million in the last week to try to keep things going like that? You can't keep that pace going indefinitely, and that's the biggest thing that has not been well addressed, that I see as a major, disastrous element, not just economic, but you can't have hospitals fall apart in the midst of a crisis like this. But our economic system has no answer, and right now for how we deal with that. So that's where we're going to see our national brand of socialist medicine is collapsing right now in a way when we need it most. And I think people coming to terms with that, coming to grips with that, is going to have to happen pretty fast.
Well, on that note, that's a great point, right? Because, again, from what we were talking about at the outset, it is prudent for our leaders to be looking at the economics of this as well. You can't just say, here's a blank check, do what you can to solve the virus. Because ultimately, when the economy collapses, the healthcare system itself will suffer. And we're seeing it happen in real time. So I think you're absolutely right to point out these hospital workers that are being furloughed. Is there a chance that things like elective procedures or procedures not directly tied to the coronavirus outbreak, the fact that it seems that, at least in my area, I could tell you anecdotally, hospitals, even though they're not seeing any cases of the coronavirus here, they're shutting down large areas of these elective procedures. Could that be harming them financially as well? And therefore the reaction is actually harming a lot of these hospitals financially, which could hurt our healthcare services as a whole?
I think a lot of places are kind of anticipating that they're going to get hit. Even the ones that haven't gotten hit yet, right. These guys look around and they see how other hospitals are doing, and they might be trying to figure out how to batten down the hatches a little bit before the storm hits. I don't think it's so much a question of people postponing a facelift. I think that most of the time hospitals are pretty close to full anyway, with patients who have real medical needs that cannot be put off. And so you have a situation now where these hospitals that are not empty are getting overwhelmed, and they're getting overwhelmed with people who are going to have a hard time paying in many cases. COVID care is, for many people, end of life care. And the vast majority of most people's medical expenses happen in the last 6 months of life. And in this case, you're seeing that happen in the last week or two of life. So you're getting people who are in an absolutely critical state getting critical medical care. I think that's where the imbalance is. We're just not set up right now to handle that in these numbers. It's not, our hospital system is not set up for a mass casualty situation.
Just a couple questions, real quick from people in the chat. Carlos wants to know if I could ask about your thoughts about the federal government and the SBA's capacity to actually disperse these funds.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we've seen here is, people have expressed their desire for at least in the last election, for a government philosophy that is designed to reduce bureaucracy, reduce investment in departments. I mean, I think we all know that Trump has intentionally, with some ideological support, has cut down a lot of the bureaucracy. CFPB, for example, which polices a lot of financial chicanery. I think you've seen that with EPA and SBA. They haven't. It's not like they've gotten a huge mandate to keep growing and growing. Part of the recent thing that people voted for was to cut down a lot of the infrastructure, and that's happened. And so when you get into a crisis where you need a lot of that, you need a lot of administrative work all of a sudden. We see the kind of crisis at the CDC. You can't just turn a switch and bring that stuff back to life when you need it. So a lot of this stuff is sort of an insurance for situations that you may not need intensely every year, but right now, I don't. That's why I think that, what I said before, I don't think there's a great plan necessarily in place for the SBA to start distributing these funds. I think that's going to be a big coordination issue.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, that's what you could see that on the ground, I think, just with, like we're talking about with the small businesses, just that I've heard in my local town that are like, I have no idea how to get this. I think that goes in conjunction with what we're talking with the SBA there, that the mechanism for not only dispersing the funds, but for teaching people how to apply for these funds, it seems like something that, I'm not trying to use this episode of the show to criticize as much, but it seems like a lesson we should learn going forth in the future, getting ready for the next sort of emergency to make sure that that system's well-oiled and working with people in the community.
Well, let me put it in perspective for you. As I said before, 99.7% of businesses are actually small businesses. And those 99.7% of businesses are getting almost the same amount of money as the 0.3% of businesses that are large businesses. So it's the same amount of money for small businesses, but there are 300 times more,
right,
of those companies around. So you could the scale of the administrative problem is apparent right there. It's going to be a lot more paperwork, and a lot more time, and a lot more money to help those small actors.
Yep, I agree. So let's move on to the infrastructure deal. Now, this hasn't occurred yet, but this is something that Trump's expressed interest in. I believe I've seen Schumer express interest. I've seen numbers as high as $2 trillion for this infrastructure bill. And for those listening that don't know, this is something that has been talked about as something that could potentially get Americans back to work, and it would be included as a next phase of the emergency bills to be able to fight against the coronavirus. So the first question I had about it, infrastructure, it seems to me to be a long-term idea. How quick do you think a bill like this would be able to spur on the economy for people that need help now? And how does this long-term bill reconcile with the government ordering people to stay at home and losing their livelihood? In other words, they're asking us to make sacrifices that impact us immediately economically, but this to me seems like it's going to be very long-term in being able to help people financially.
Yeah, it's like we got the sugar and the fat, but where's the protein in the middle? I mean, it's like, think about how long we heard about that. I don't know about you, but I saw this come up as a 2-hour blip on the news 2 days ago, and then it disappeared.
Right.
So I think for most people, it's off topic right now. And I don't think people are really paying attention to it. And I don't think people will be turning their attention to it for a while. So, we need some infrastructure investment, but I think it kind of fell a little flat. And I think we'll revisit that at some time.
Well, the reason I bring it up, and I'll put it to you in the terms of a question like this. Do you share my concern that when things like this happen, even if we're giving the best intent to government actors, that they really are trying their best to help with the disease, to help with the economy, it seems to me that a crisis like this oftentimes could be taken advantage of. And all of a sudden, the printing press of the money just starts going off the rails. This, to me, seemed that type of thing where it's just, you have people saying, oh, yeah, here's another $2 trillion here. That could help the situation. And so the reason I bring it up is my concern is that the longer this draws out, the more stuff we'll start to hear like this, where it's, it's acting like the money is just, it's just coming out of thin air. We'll put $2 trillion here. We need infrastructure. It's not a money situation, but right, we just heard Trump like, we're going to start fighting the cartels. We're going to do that. We're going to send a ship to Venezuela, and we're going to start a war on drugs in Venezuela, or however he put it. It seems to me that there's this mission creep. It's ever expanding. Well, we have to do everything possible, and I'm concerned that it's going to get out of control and cause more harm than it's worth.
I think that we're going to see a lot of those side initiatives kind of fizzle out a little bit. I think the amount of attention that this has taken for everyone to kind of think about Corona and the coordination is going to, those things might be a distraction for temporarily, but I think the number one concern on everybody's mind is pretty constant. It's pretty clear to me. Yeah, infrastructure is a long-term bet. It's going to be a lot of money. And it's going to take it takes a lot of planning and coordination to spend infrastructure money. We're talking decades. So I think there'll be an impact, but I doubt it's going to be much in the course of this administration.
Yeah, fair enough. So let's move on to the $4 trillion in Fed liquidity. So for those that don't know, A couple weeks ago, I was watching. I try to watch most of the press conferences on the virus, and Trump was talking about how this bill, that between the Republican and the Democrat proposed bill, I believe it was $2 to 2.5 trillion, and then it was out of nowhere. It seemed that I can't think of his name right now, but Kudlow, who's his economic advisor, came out and was like, "Well, actually, the total bill right now will be 6 trillion because there's going to be 4 trillion in Fed liquidity." And I have a slight idea of what that is, but it was very much a confusing thing. And that's a lot of money. That's double what the emergency spending bill was. So could you just briefly explain, when they talk about having $4 trillion in Fed liquidity, what are they talking about and what would that money be used for?
So $4 trillion, where does that come from? The Fed has a few magical powers. One of them is the ability to expand the monetary supply, and what we're seeing that come from is they could actually issue loans. They could actually engage in open market operations as well, where they buy treasury bonds and bills, and they could actually pump money into the economy that way. So they have the ability to do that as part of their normal operation. Now, part of the way they could do that is that they could actually get a loan from the Treasury Department, which can give the Fed an initial buffer, and through our fractional reserve banking system. What the Federal Reserve is going to be able to do is, by giving banks additional liquidity, when a bank gets money, it lends money out, and that goes into other banks that lend it out again and again and again. Right now, banks are required to hold 10% of their capital in reserve. So when the Fed lends out, $400 billion or buys $400 billion of bills and bonds and puts that money into the system, that 400 billion will multiply by a factor of 10 over time. And they can also do things where they can adjust how much banks have to hold in reserve as well. And it's quite likely that they're going to do that. So, but a lot of that money is going to come from direct lending from the Fed. So they could launch all kinds of measures, and they have different tools to be able to effectively give people large loans that are operated through the banking system. And that's where that multiplication is going to come from for the most part.
So one of the questions I asked you before was, 4 trillion, again, once for an average person, when we hear these numbers, they sound almost made up. Like $4 trillion, you could hardly imagine it. What is the Fed's current balance sheet? And the reason that I want to know is, it's 4 trillion like only 2% of what they're currently have on their balance sheet, or is it a much higher number?
It represents around a doubling of their balance sheet, actually. So generally speaking, it's recent times it's been about around $4 trillion, and so this is about going to double it. So this is a major rapid growth of the Fed's operations in the short term.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I suspected and what I had thought, and that gives you reason. Now, certainly, this is being treated as a crisis that's an unprecedented crisis. So in this situation, you could see, okay, maybe in an unprecedented move, they're doubling their balance sheet, but it's certainly nothing to sneeze at. It's a big deal. It's not something that occurs regularly to double their balance sheet like this.
Mm-hmm. No, it's not. Usually operations are, maybe in the effective impacts are usually in a few $100 billion range. So this is a lot of money at once.
Yes. So we talked about how this would be used to lend money to banks so that they would be able to lend out. Will there be any sort of a possibility for nationalization of businesses that accept these loans if they can't pay back? Is there a time frame for them paying this back? And if there is going to be nationalization, can you tell us what that means?
Nationalization, that's a powerful and loaded word. It means different things at different times in different countries. At the extreme, it means governments actually taking over businesses and running them. I don't think our government's going to get into that business. But what we did see, for example, 2008 financial crisis times, the government had to bail out a lot of big companies, and the way they did it in many cases is that in exchange for taking bailing these companies out with big loans, they'd also buy a lot of stock at the same time and
Okay.
take partial ownership of these companies. And what they eventually did, they weren't managing or running these companies. They just kind of getting their hooks in a little bit. But it's not really in our DNA to have nationalization as a country. What happened over time in that situation was the government did eventually sell off almost all these securities in order just to fund the government again. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the government take over or buy stock on a temporary basis in a lot of these companies. But I wouldn't think that would be a very long-term situation. They'd probably let that go after a while. And I think part of that is just to keep those companies, keep them afloat and keep them and change and have some impact on how they do their business. One of the very important impacts of the Trump tax cuts in recent years for companies is that companies have taken hundreds of billions of dollars and bought back their own stock.
Right.
So a lot of that money has gone right back out to shareholders and just exited companies. It's goosed up share prices, but it hasn't really increased economic demand. So that's why you saw like a lot of these tax breaks didn't really increase unemployment that much. The money went off their balance sheet and back to shareholders. I think right now we're not in a position where that's going to be, because these companies have such a high demand for cash that those buybacks are going to be put on hold for a while. So it's not going to be business as usual as it's been under the current administration. And I wouldn't be surprised to see temporary stock buyback measures from the government itself. The stock, that stock buying activity, but full blown nationalization, I don't think we're quite there yet. But there'll be some flavor of it, I think.
Okay. Just kind of just go off that for a second. You mentioned the stock buybacks bumping up the prices of these stocks and the value of these stocks. Just out of curiosity, just strictly your opinion, I'm of the opinion that we were in a bubble anyways, that things were inflated way more than their actual value would be. Do you think that was the case, or is it are we even able to quantify what that means? And if so, do you think that there's a potential silver lining that maybe after we get out of this economic turmoil as a result of this, we kind of popped a bubble that was going to pop at some level anyways?
So a bubble usually means that there is, a distorted amount of the economy's sort of dollars that are mapped into a certain place, that stock companies are worth more than they're really worth. And ultimately the value of a company, the stock, is worth the future cash flow of that company. That's what actually theoretically sets the value of a company. That's what gives it a worth that's 5 or 10 or 20 times its annual earnings, because it's calculated out into the future and discounted to the present. But what the impact of tax cuts actually does, at least on a dollar basis, increase the value of companies, because they're able to retain more of their earnings. So it's not entirely clear to me that it was a bubble. You could very well say that the fact that the Trump tax cuts had made it more profitable to run these companies did in fact make them more valuable. But when you see that the profit disappear, you do see a corresponding crash in the values that happens very quickly as well, because the lower taxes don't help you when you have no revenue.
Right. Yeah, which makes sense. Now you mentioned this would be basically a doubling or near a doubling of the Fed's balance sheet. Is there a threshold where the Fed printing money like this or creating money like this, where you think that there's a time for you, it would raise an eyebrow and say, whoa, this is too much too soon? Could this lead to the world losing faith in the dollar as a reserve currency? And can you, we'll stop there. I can ask the third question here later.
Well, yeah, I right now, because a lot of dollars have disappeared from our system, the Fed kind of expanding those back out temporarily, I think is helpful in the sense that it props up the value of the dollar where it needs to be. It gets it back where it needs to be, but I think that has to be met with a steady, controlled contraction of the dollars that the Fed has put out once the economy starts to grow again. And I think that's going to be one of the toughest calls that the Fed is going to face. How does it start to rein in that credit? There's going to be a point in time where we really need to stimulate the economy and see that grow. And so anything that you do to contract that supply slows that down. So there's going to be, I think, a conflict for a while. And we may not have to retrieve much of the Fed may not have to retrieve a lot of that money right now if it's filling in this these gaps, and these gaps become part of the new economy that emerges after Corona. Um, you know, the money that the Fed has created may just be needed to fill in the money that's been destroyed. So I think that the balancing act that they need to pull off, there'll be some adjustment they need to make. It's going to take a few years to see the impact and judge that. So I think that reining back in credit will be a slow process and should be a measured process.
Yeah, and again, my worry is even if we could say that this would be the proper process to do now, it would be proper for the Fed to kind of create this $4 trillion. It seems that there will be a tendency anytime there seems to be some sort of economic trouble. Maybe you have, for me, look, I'm a Trump supporter, but it seems that Trump's often kind of getting in Jerome Powell's ear and getting in the Fed's ear saying, do this, do this, do this. Is this going to be a new norm that we see, that anytime there's any types of fears of a recession, that we have executive branch people saying, hey, why don't you just increase the supply of money? Why don't we just have some more Fed liquidity? Because at some point it will be too much, right? Inflation would get to be too much.
I think that Jerome Powell kind of took a few steps ahead of the president on this last one. He went out pretty fast, and the Fed kind of spent its ammo with interest rates pretty quickly. But you could say that they were already responding to the president's pressures and encouragement before that. But it's easy to say in retrospect whether it was too much or too little. I think this is one of those crises where you're going to see, you're going to be able to see some mistakes made, but I feel it's a little bit hard to criticize them because looking at the economy from where they're looking at, they're doing. I honestly think they were doing the best they could do given their understanding of the tool set that they had.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay, so that was kind of the bills that had. So I just had some kind of more general economic questions. So the first one I had was, I've seen numbers suggesting that up to a third of employable people in America could end up unemployed as a result of this. Assuming the lockdown ends in a month or two, how long do you think it will take for the economy to rebound to see a significant portion of these people to get jobs? In other words, let's say that it actually opens up April 30th, like Trump suggested. Do you think because the collapse was so sudden that we'll see a rebound that's also very sudden?
I really doubt that. The reason why I doubt that is because coronavirus is spreading across the country at different speeds in different places, and it's hitting different places with different impact. So there's parts of the country where you have older people, more older people than younger people, and you have all kinds of the spread of the disease is not well coordinated. It's a virus. It's not a system that responds to human poking and prodding very readily. So I think that's going to definitely contribute to massive coordination problems in getting the country back up and running, because the impact will be uneven in time and uneven in geography. So when you get coordination problems on a large scale in an economy, that's the toughest problem to solve, because you do now all of a sudden have large pieces of the economy, people who are out of work and not generating demand either to compensate and create a need for the supply. So I think because of that, it's going to take a long time for the economy to really recover. I think we'll start to see some recovery, happen over the course of months. But I think the overall impact is highly likely to lead to at least some kind of soft depression for some period of time. I think we'll be cleaning up the mess. The government, has been responding to this, and I think that we're going to start seeing the mess start to get cleaned up pretty soon. Probably towards the end of this year, we'll really start seeing some cleanup measures. But I think it's going to take really about 5 to 7 years to see a full recovery. I mean, that it took several years with the financial crisis from a few years ago, and that was a smaller scale problem than now, believe it or not. That was a big issue. I think we have a lot more tools and a lot more knowledge historically than during the Great Depression in the 30s. So I don't think it's going to be a decade-long thing, and I don't think World War III is going to get us out of this one.
Right.
But I think it'll take a few years to clean up all the damage, and I think the economy that emerges will be different than the one that we left. Um, I think right now we've all you and I are using Zoom for this interview, but now a lot of people are using Zoom um, for just doing their work.
Right. Yep.
I I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a permanent 5 or 10% drop in workplace commutes going into the future as people have will get used to working like this for who knows how many months, and people are going to ask, hey, why do we need to even have offices? Why do we need to drive around? And that's those habits are going to have a long-term impact.
Well, yeah, I
So it's
agree.
going to take a while.
And this is something that Carlos and I talked about immediately. For example, take just something simple like universities. I think a lot of universities are going to start to see, wait a minute, a lot of this overhead we have on the cost of maintaining buildings and things like that, we're able to have successful classes that were imparting just as much knowledge, and we were able to have these classes online. So of course, there will be losers in that situations too. If you're a landlord and you're renting out mall space and things like that, you might tend to lose as things become more digital kind of faster than they otherwise would have because we've been forced to social distance with the coronavirus. But do you think that this will help usher in kind of significant change, not just in the value of our economy, but in the way that our economy functions?
I absolutely do. Yeah, in a way, this has been a sudden experiment forced on us, but the this crucible test of our entire the new technology infrastructure and tools that are available to us. I think this will really open people's eyes up to a whole new way of doing business, and in a way, I think despite the economic problems and some of the infrastructural challenges we're going to face, you're going to see some areas of the economy are going to become much more efficient because of this crisis.
Yeah.
So I think in a way it's going to have some really interesting long-term impacts that are actually going to help us in some ways once we get through the pain of this period.
Right, right. So you mentioned the Great Depression. One of the things that someone like me tends to do is you look at the raw numbers. So you look at something like unemployment numbers or the percentage of GDP that contracts, and you want to liken it to a period in history. So when you look at those numbers and you liken them to the Great Depression, are the numbers we're looking at now similar or are they worse than those? And does that necessarily mean, though, because I have a hunch that because we have kind of a better kind of infrastructure in many ways, both culturally, socially, and even economically, does that mean if the numbers are as bad or worse, that we'll see the exact same type of pain, like bread lines and things that we saw during the Depression?
During the Great Depression, unemployment at its peak reached about a quarter.
Okay.
We're already around there.
Yeah.
It looks like we're going to get to there, if not. But I do think getting back to the tool set, we know a lot. There was a Federal Reserve back then. There were government programs back then, but their understanding of how to kind of push and pull the levers of economy were actually a little bit more rudimentary. We've learned a lot since then. So I think, and we are in a much better place, in terms of technology. There we have the great Eisenhower national highway system and all that stuff. Yep. We have infrastructure that didn't exist back then, so I think in many ways we'll be able to bounce back more quickly. And I don't think that we're going to have the same kind of problems that we had. It's not going to look the same. This depression is not going to be the last one, and it probably won't be as severe in terms of the depth of the length of the problem. But I do think that we'll have some temporary pain there. I think we'll be able to bounce back faster for the most part. As I said, a few years to really clean up the mess.
Right.
But I'm not that pessimistic that I think we'll be going back to the Great Depression.
Okay. All right. What about the idea? So we already talked about 99% or so of businesses are small businesses. What happens? What would the economy look like if a lot of those small businesses are unable to reopen? Would it have a massive shift on the overall value of the economy, or would it just kind of be a makeover on what the economy would look like?
I think I think that would be pretty problematic because, people's livelihoods depend in large part because half the people work in small businesses. It's an absolutely critical part of the economy. And once you have a business, when a business fails, it affects all the other businesses that are connected to it, and as well as the employees that work there and the owners of the company. So uh, I think it will be critical for us to, to have that government support that is needed to, on a temporary basis at least, to help those companies recover. And companies are still going to go out of business, and uh, you know, but at the same time, we're gonna have to kind of get through that and sort it out, because we don't really have an alternative to getting small businesses back and healthy and operating. So I think that's going to be a big focus of our economic recovery.
I agree. So a couple questions that are coming in. Fabian wants to know, will the U.S. economy still be the strongest in the world or one of the strongest in the world as after all of this is said and done?
I think we undoubtedly will be. I think we're actually taking a bit of a disproportionate hit from this virus, because we have a large country. It's not strongly centrally coordinated in terms of the virus response. And we also have a tradition of freedom. So we're not closing down the same way that China did. We're kind of doing it in a piecemeal way. It's not as strict. So we're going to get hit pretty hard by this thing. And so I think we're going to recover. I still think we're going to be very strong right now in terms of sort of uh, uh, right now. China is bigger than the U.S. economy in some ways, and smaller in others. Depending on whether you measure in terms of, like, dollar equivalents or purchasing power parity. But we're still going to be a very large economy, and we're still going to be the sort of the currency that drives the world for a while. I believe. I don't think that's going to go away, and I think that the fact that the U.S. dollar is so prominent overseas as a means of exchange in many countries is going to help actually prop us up and keep us healthy.
Yeah, and on that note, one of the things that I actually felt better after talking to you the other day was this idea I had of, will countries lose faith in the dollar if they see that the Federal Reserve is printing so much more money? And a point that you made that maybe you can elaborate on here is, but it's not happening in a vacuum. The entire world's kind of going through a very similar thing. Even if it's disproportionately hurting the US, the world understands, well, it wasn't like, it was peacetime, nothing's going on, and all of a sudden the Fed's like, hey, we'll double our balance sheet for the heck of it. So I think that that's absolutely true, if you wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, like right now, we're in an economy, we're in a situation where the entire world is going through this sort of contractionary process at once. So really, the biggest impact happens when you're going ahead or behind other countries, not in lockstep. So relatively speaking, we're kind of in the same boat. And I think that if the Federal Reserve's expansionary actions sort of fill in the gaps that are left, and do that responsibly, I think that will mute the impact, and I think we're still going to retain that stability. I think we even may emerge stronger in the sense that a lot of countries that have a less coordination or a weaker economy than ours may experience some collapse in their currencies, and will come to rely on the U.S. dollar as their own kind of reserve currency of sorts.
So Max wants to know, and I'll elaborate in this question a little, should we be taking our cash out of the banks right now? Or what would you advise, not in a prepper sense, like, build a bunker and get a bunch of ammo, but just what would be some prudent things for everyday Americans to be doing with their money out? Should we be taking cash out of banks, or does that seem a little short-sighted?
I'm not sure it'll help much to take money out of banks. I'm not sure, because I believe that the federal government is still dedicated and has the power to ensure most bank deposits for most people. We still have an FDIC, and I think we can still rely on that mechanism. I I think that at the same time that there may be some longer term opportunities to buy stock, for example, or invest. There's also going to be a period where it's stocks have gone down for a reason. It's going to be uncertain how this whole situation shakes out, and we're not going to recover for at least a few months. So I would say keep an eye out for opportunity. But your money in the bank in a deflationary scenario where you have now is in a pretty good place. It's certainly better to have had your money in the bank than to have had it in stocks over the last few weeks. So at some point, I think we're going to see that the recovery start to happen. But I think if you're keeping your eyes on the market and keeping your ears to the ground, you'll be able to kind of pick that point just as well as anybody else. So I think it's going to be a slow road going up, and I don't think you have to panic and start buying gold and start to. And I don't think it's quite time to buy stock yet. So I think most people can hold on to their cash, and that might be the best place to keep it for now.
Okay, yeah. So one of the things that a lot of people have been asking about in the chat is BlackRock. And I know that we had talked about kind of the idea of it, the problems that could arise with Trump kind of requesting oversight control of the trillions in emergency funds. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's through the organization BlackRock. Maybe you could tell me if I'm wrong about that. But what are some of the potential pitfalls of having the executive branch or people that he's appointing kind of have the management over these sorts of funds?
So I'm not specifically aware of what the BlackRock involvement, but I do know that Congress did have to pass a law to make sure that the Trump's extended family, including Kushner and the extended Kushner family, did not particularly benefit from these recovery funds. And I think that we have to be careful because we have a president who has not been very transparent, frankly, with his personal finances, promised to release taxes, didn't do that, and who has businesses that have not been divested. And a lot of those businesses are, for example, in the hospitality industry and have been greatly affected by coronavirus. And you might say it's not fair that he doesn't get help, but at the same time, we have to focus on, I think, this is not the time that we can have, any kind of diversion or corruption in the system that takes us away from what we need, which is recovery of the greater economy. It's the needs of the many and the needs of the few situation where we have to, I think, be very careful. And so oversight is very critical. The president, included a signing note recently saying that they're not necessarily going to have to report auditing information to Congress based on how the money is spent. I don't think that's going to fly. I think that there's going to be a lot of pushback from that because it's just too much money to allow it to not be reported and accounted for. So I think that I think we're going to see a lot of discipline, and we've already seen actually, frankly, a lot of discipline imposed on this administration. They've started to become more forthright with how they express information and how they relate to the public. So, which is a good thing in my view. And I think adequate and responsible money management is going to be part of that, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and let me just say, I don't think that this is a partisan thing at all. I think if you really think about it, that we should want oversight regardless if it's someone you support in there or someone that's not. Just for an example, I don't know that this is true. I've heard the reports, and everyone should have their day in court, but you've heard of senators from both sides of the aisle supposedly selling off stock when they got the report of the potential impact of the coronavirus, and that was Republicans and Democrats. So to me, that story just illustrates no matter if it's your person or not, you should want some sort of oversight to make sure that there's accountability for this money.
Yeah, that case was interesting. So a lot of people say that was kind of insider trading. I'm really not sure I agree because I think there was a lot of information that coronavirus was going to be a problem.
Right.
I think it might have been hypocritical for some of those senators to keep it saying that, hey, go out, our business is fine, at the same time that they were they may have been selling stock, but you could just as easily say everyone just by turning on the news was able to see the scope of the issue and how it was kind of creeping up over here. So I that to me is something where it's arguable. I agree. I think you have to make a decision based on the information at hand.
Well, listen though, here's one thing: people want a villain. With a situation like this, it's cathartic for people to be able to point a finger at a person and say, aha, there's someone who did something bad. So I think that's why I've hesitated to even talk about it much, because I know oftentimes with things like this, people could get vilified and the actual details could get lost in the shuffle. Now, I do think there's enough there to warrant at least some sort of body investigating, but I'm not going to declare guilt or innocence based on the limited information I have.
That's a great point. And the fact is that, this is for the last time there was a pandemic approaching this was 1918, and information wasn't as easily distributed back then. And so, everyone born who's alive now, for the most part, is facing a completely unprecedented situation. Um, and so, we're seeing that play out, and we're seeing, people react. I think what people are going to want to see is government taking certain steps to take care of the crisis that is developing in front of them and reacting to it. And I think one of the things that this is going to force is a little bit of a reckoning where people say, hey, you know what, absolutist political ideologies of any kind have to take a back seat to the emergency response needs when you're facing a crisis of this nature. And so, it's going to, I think, have a tempering effect on people of all political stripes, because they're going to say, like, you have to react to the situation at hand. And sometimes you have to understand that cases like this are the exception that prove the rule. This is one of those so-called black swan events that are unforeseen and surprising, and you need to react to them as they come along. And mistakes will be made, but good things will happen too. And I think that we'll learn from that.
Yeah, and I think that we should be looking for the positives that could come out of it. I mean, obviously, the first criteria is to triage and to do what we can to help the economy, help with the virus, etc. But yeah, I mean, certainly it's worth looking at what are the silver linings that could come out of this. So just to give you a little of where my take has been on this, my anger at the government, I'm not an ideologue in the sense that as a conservative constitutionalist, that I think, the government could never step in and take these measures in case of emergency. I fully believe that they should be able to. Where my disappointment comes in is I feel that the founding fathers taught us that before we accept infringement on rights, we should have the government at least meticulously explain to us what they're doing and why they're doing it and how that would have some sort of positive effect. And I think that I've seen a letdown on that. I'm in Pennsylvania. I've seen a letdown on my governor, who's Democrat. I've seen a letdown at the federal level where I think it's Trump, who's a Republican. So I'm equal opportunity disappointed. And I think that these questions should have been answered, such as what were the models saying that they were using? What was the threshold for when they would take some of these actions? Exactly how would all this money get spent? One of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you is I think it's kind of a shame that our media and just our government in general, they're not really explaining things like you are to the general people. And if I turn on Fox News or CNN and MSNBC, no one's really just asking basic questions for the average American to understand. Okay, what does this mean? What does $4 trillion in liquidity mean? How will this go? So I was just wondering if you could comment on it. It seems that one of the lessons we need to learn is there needs to be more transparency and more honesty with why decisions are being made and exactly what those decisions mean.
That would be a great thing. I think one of the challenges that politicians deal with day to day is that they tend to have a constituency that helped them get into power. They tend to need to serve that, or feel they need to serve that, or put more emphasis there. And when it comes to politics, a lot of politics is resource allocation decisions. A lot of politics is economics in that sense, raw economics, who gets what when. And so most of the time, that transparency is not there because people don't really want to talk about the reasons why this person or this group is getting more than another.
Right.
Because you're usually shuffling resources around, and there's usually some sort of zero-sum aspect in many cases. So right now, we're seeing a situation where, a lot of traditional understanding of rights and the role of government are taking a back seat to the immediate needs in front of us. And I think there'll be on some level a reckoning, but I also think that people are going to look back and say, well, it was an exception.
Yeah, I agree.
And so we tend not to learn lessons over time that we don't need to learn. So I think that we'll need to learn, we will. And that's stuff that, psychologically as a species, we'll want to forget about, and as quickly as we can, we will too.
I agree. So in that note, one of the things I was trying to do is You're exactly right with what you said about the economic decisions. There's almost never a clear-cut right answer when it comes to those decisions, by the way. And so in this case, we're taking some sort of trade-off of economics and liberty for a trade-off of safety. And it's not a flippant question. It's not something that I think you could just be an ideologue and say, no, I always favor freedom or economics, or I always favor... Almost all of us will be somewhere in a sliding scale there. So what I'm trying to do is get an idea of what the cost benefit will be to inaction on the one extreme, to the cost benefit to complete total, controlling the entire economy or controlling the entire situation by the government. So in that vein, do you have any idea? And I know this is kind of an unfair question. It's probably impossible to answer, but what do you think an economic impact would have been had we not had a sort of lockdown, shutdown the way we did, and potentially millions would have passed? Like the one estimate that Dr. Fauci gave was 2.2 million. And the reason is I'm not just looking at it economically, but I'm trying to get an idea of what would the economics look like of doing nothing versus how they'll look like now, just to get a comparison.
I think that the shutdown was forced on us because, if you don't shut down, that's right, we will see numbers like that. I think we've seen numbers from 1% to 3% of the total mortality rate, but that tends to be the people who are known to be infected. They've done some other studies that say about 0.6 or so of the population will die from these diseases if it's controlled to some level. If we had not done this, we would have seen those numbers start to skyrocket and go out of control. And that would lead to problems with social stability. It wouldn't have been helpful for anybody. And we would have seen a shutdown, but it would have been uncontrolled panic type shutdowns. And so that's not the kind of situation we need to see. So we have something where, there's measured reasons and communication why people need to stay at home and shelter in place. I think people will understand and respect that. At the same time, culturally, and it's a big deal, we're not China. We're not an authoritarian government. America can and does, historically, we can and do select some level of mortality and death for our freedoms. We select that for example, cigarette smoking. We haven't really controlled cigarette smoking like other countries do. We don't control guns like other countries do. There is a cost to that. So, we do make consciously that choice and that trade-off, and it's part of the cultural DNA of the country. So to some extent, we do accept, a higher human impact as the cost of freedom. And it is something we pay for. And so I think that's just, the nature of the country and the nature of where we're at. And, that balance may shift over time one way or another. But I think America will emerge from this still America. And so, we're going to have, that's part of why we have an impact. But also Americans are, to some extent altruistic and they care about each other. Americans are friendlier to each other in many cases than people of other countries. So we do have a sort of national spirit that is real. And so I think people will understand that, and they are responding and coming together, especially when their government, local governments tell them, hey, we need to slow down. We need to stay at home for a while. And I think people are taking that in good spirit for the most part. So, that's our country.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I'm trying to do. And look, a lot of my videos are very critical of what I see as missteps leading up to this and missteps of lack of transparency during it with the government. But one of the things I'm trying to do just to maintain my own sanity is get those inspiring individual stories you see. Maybe a private business that's doing the right thing by their company, their employees during this tough time, or individuals that are doing stuff to help their neighbors. So that is something I'm working on. I'm trying to compile stories like that because I think that is the great strength of America. It's individuals, it's personal liberty and responsibility, and how in times of crisis, Americans seem to be able to come together, not because necessarily the government forced them to, but because we have this kind of spirit of, entrepreneurship and camaraderie to help, our fellow people out. So I agree with you there. I'm trying to get more of that. Just a couple more questions I had. Do you think, I know you said that you think that it'll take 5 to 7 years possibly to recover, and that, it'll be tough getting out of the mire immediately. It could take till the end of the year till we start to see it stabilize. But hypothetically, do you think there is a situation where we could see that, as Trump said, that the cure could be worse than the virus? In other words, if the economic downturn would be so severe or last so long, do you think we could actually see an impact on lives lost or just lives extremely negatively affected to where the economic downturn as a result of the reactions could be worse than what the virus itself did?
I mean, I think to some extent that's really rhetoric. I think we need to focus on the practical, immediate issues in front of us. Like, for example, one of those situations in which the concern you talk about is a reality that we have to deal with is the shutdown of large parts of hospitals that's happening now because they don't have funds to pay people during this corona crisis. So that's something we have to solve, because that really will result in additional fatalities and mortality if we don't deal with that. So there are going to be practical problems that we need to solve. But I really do feel that the shutdown was kind of forced on us by this virus. If we didn't respond to it, it would be worse, because people are people, and we do need to avoid undue economic slowdown. But a panic is not going to help anybody, and that would be worse for the economic system. It would be worse in many cases for stuff like hoarding, and that behavior is starting to go away as people, have picked up what they need, and that's starting to stabilize. But maintaining confidence is essential, because the economy ultimately is the coordination of confidence. Money itself is psychological. It's not something real and physical. It's something we react to money because we're thinking that money has value, and we think our neighbor will accept money in the future for goods and services. So we need to believe in the economy. We need to have confidence in order to have a functional economy. So taking prudent steps to slow things down a bit and maintain confidence and avoid panic is as pro-economic as you can get, in my mind, because that's really where it gets down to the reality of people's behavior. So you want people to have confidence that there is a system and it will survive. That's very important.
Yeah, and that's a really, so I was a collegiate debater. So what you're doing, something that it's very intelligent. What you want to look at how the issue that you're focused on affects the issue that other people are focused on. So the economy and healthcare are intertwined, right? If one, in both cases, you don't want to see the reaction cause too much of a massive decline in one, or the virus, because it will, regardless of what you are most concerned about, they're intertwined. So I think it's very smart what you said. So just, this isn't really an economic question, but if we have a couple more minutes, I thought it might be worth asking because it's kind of a numbers question. How will we know? My concern is, without the government kind of giving these basic answers before they took action for things like exactly what their models were, what their threshold for taking these actions were, how will we know at the end of the day how successful the government's policies were as far as curtailing the virus? Because it seems to me, the skeptical nature of me thinks it's going to be like the Patriot Act, where I always say, I call it Schrodinger's Patriot Act, where they passed it, and after they passed the Patriot Act, we could have went 10 years without a terrorist attack. And I don't think the government would have been like, okay, we no longer need the Patriot Act. They would have said, see, it was successful. We stopped terrorism. But if there were triple the amount of attacks, they would have said, see, we were correct to do so, because look at how much terrorism there was. So I'm starting to see now credible medical professionals come out and say, it's not that they're even criticizing the actions of the government necessarily, but they're saying, we feel that your models were grossly over-exaggerated. Is there a way that you could think of that we will be able to look and see, was the reaction too much? Even if you think it was prudent to overreact as opposed to underreacting, is there a chance, is there any way you could see how we'll be able to decipher whether or not it was an overreaction or if it was exactly what was needed?
I think we will be able to piece that together, and I think it'll take a few years for those studies to come out. But I think here's how we'll know. There are different parts of the world and different parts of the country that reacted differently. There's a ton of data that's going to come out of this situation. It's going to take a while to sort out, but there's an enormous amount of data that's coming out of this situation. And I'm absolutely confident that the analysis will become clear over time. And there's going to be so much. There's going to be many PhDs that are built based on the statistical analysis of what happened during the COVID crisis. I can tell you that. So I think there's going to be a lot of study and deep understanding of what happened. It's a major public health crisis. We're going to have to understand it to understand how to deal with these potential situations in the future. So I think over time it'll become apparent from looking at different parts of the world that took one response type versus another. They'll correct for population age and all kinds of factors, but we'll see that information come out over time. So I think we will learn that.
Yeah. Okay. I guess just a generic last question. Do you think that the leadership, whether it be leadership you see at state levels, leadership at the federal level, do you think overall they're doing what you would consider a decent job? Do you see some leader that you feel is doing better than others? Or do you see a leader that, in your opinion, I know it's just your opinion, but that you think particularly is doing a bad job?
I think we see the most interesting variation among governors.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm not gonna criticize the president because I think people voted for the president and they're getting what they voted for. That's that is what it is.
Right.
But a lot of some governors have reacted quickly and are getting out there and communicating. Andrew Cuomo of New York has been very prominent in the news, and he's been out there. He's been coordinating responses. His state's been hard hit. I think you've seen that response in New Jersey, California. You've seen those quick responses. I think you've seen some states like Florida, in my mind, and Alabama stick out as states that are way behind the curve. And I think you're seeing that impact, and it's gonna kind of come up with a delayed reaction. I think that I think people are going to learn from that. Unfortunately, I feel that it's very likely that the people of some states are going to suffer a disparate impact and take it more on the chin with this one because they didn't have that leadership that said, okay, we have to shut down. This year is an exception, and we have to deal with the situation at hand. And so, I think that's going to feed into our national, awareness and our national politics for years to come. And I think it's going to have, in many cases, people are going to have to look at those things thoughtfully, and I think they will. I'm optimistic that way. And I think the good old American spirit of ingenuity will come in and figure out the best solutions for the future, too.
Well, hey, I just want to thank you so much for coming on. I might not agree with all of our political ideologies or how we think who's acting the best or something, but I am, without a doubt, I think that you are spot on with everything you said economically. I really do. And I think it's really important for people. I hope that many more people watch this because I think we both tried to do a good job to keep politics out of it as much as possible and just talk about the actual numbers. And it's important that people just kind of get an understanding because, I kind of casually probably follow this stuff more than the average American, and I'm thoroughly confused by what we saw with a lot of this. So thank you so much for helping me understand it and everyone else. And I hope after this, I would love to talk to you about some things maybe more philosophically about the economy, like Keynesian versus Austrian economics and just the Federal Reserve in general. But I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk about this.
Robert, it was a great pleasure, an honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. And I'll talk to you soon. So everyone else, thank you so much for listening. If you could, please share this video with people. Possibly, I don't know if you'd be interested in Monir coming back on if we see significant changes or if other questions arise. But I think it's really great to share this type of information. So thank you from both of us, and we hope that you all stay safe. And as always, have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.